Who are today's students in a diverse society? In some ways, children never change. The pictures of children in classic literature are as true today as when they were first written. Look at the conniving, mischievous Tom Sawyer, the overly curious Alice in Wonderland, the magical Harry Potter, or the adventurous Jack and Annie. These characters are endearing to us in part because we have all known children like them. Real children of today are also very much like the children of yesterday or the children of tomorrow. Certain stages of cognitive, social, emotional, and physical development have been identified and are similar progression through these stages. And a similar progression through these stages occurs for everyone. We all have the basic psychology and physical needs that cut across racial, cultural, age, ability, and gender boundaries. You learn a great deal about these subjects in your own courses in child or adolescent development and educational psychology. As a teacher, understanding these stages of development and areas of common needs gives you insight into student behavior and helps you develop appropriate classroom experiences. Even so, it is also important to be sensitive to the great differences among students and to factors in our society that are directly affecting their lives. How schools approach issues of diversity have direct implications on student learning. In this chapter, we hope to make you more fully aware of the diversity in our society and classrooms, the range of abilities among the students you will encounter in schools, attempts to address all these areas of diversity. We also hope to make you more aware of and sensitive to the sorts of issues, potential problems, and benefits related to diversity. You will see diversity in your students among a number of dimensions, including who they are, what they need, and what kind of abilities they have. Students in your classroom are likely to come from a variety of racial and ethnic backgrounds, representing many different cultures and ways of looking at the world. Cultural differences among teachers and students can give rise to misunderstandings unless you learn more about your students' backgrounds and expectations. Multicultural educational approaches help students learn to appreciate the contributions of all people. Some of your students may speak a primary language other than English. We will see that parents, educators, and policymakers have become divided, often bitterly so, over the best way to teach these English language learners in U.S. public schools. Another dimension of diversity will be seen in the academic abilities and achievements of your students. Some students will enter the school environment and immediately do well. Others will appear not to respond to your teaching. One of your biggest challenges as a teacher will be to provide a variety of learning experiences. Students in your classroom will develop at different rates and display diverse needs. Recognizing these needs will help you better understand some student behaviors and increase your insight into how to respond. Boys and girls, even when they come from the same socioeconomic, racial, or ethnic group, are different. They are raised differently even within the same families, and often society has different expectations of them. Treating boys and girls equitably as individuals and not as gender stereotypes is a constant challenge for both male and female teachers. Regardless of your own beliefs on the subject of homosexuality, if you are going to teach in the public schools, you may very well teach lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender students. Work with LGBT fellow educators and interact with LGBT families. As a teacher, you are entrusted to establish and maintain safe and supportive classroom environment for these and all of your students. Your students will come from families with varied socioeconomic backgrounds. The benefits of being a child from a family in higher socioeconomic class often show up in school performance. Children from such families typically do much better academically than students from families in lower socioeconomic classes. Teachers and schools are challenged to ensure all students have successful schooling experiences. This topic is discussed in more detail in Chapter 4. Although American society has always been composed of various races, ethnicities, and cultures. Today, we are experiencing even greater cultural diversity. An analysis of census data reveals 6 demographic trends that could have a significant impact on schools. These demographic shifts are: over half the U.S. population growth occurred in southern states. 65% of the population is non-Hispanic white. This number is down from 76% in 1995. The number of people marrying across racial and ethnic lines has doubled since 1980. Baby boomers are now reaching retirement age, resulting in a mass exodus of people from the workforce. Women fill almost half of all jobs in our nation, and the gender wage gap is the lowest in history. The number of grandparent-headed households has increased to 26% over the last. The number of grandparent-headed households has increased 26% over the last 10 years. Just as our American population is becoming more and more diverse, so are our classrooms. Given that classrooms are a microcosm of society, we must explore ways to create successful learning environments for the students who enter our classrooms. We know that schools that embrace diversity are richer learning environments. Students who attend schools that embrace diversity are better prepared to be engaged citizens. The term race refers to people with common ancestry and physical characteristics, whereas the term ethnicity applies to people who may be racially similar or different, but who share common culture, including language, customs, and religion. Public school classrooms include an even higher percentage of minorities than the population as a whole. Although about 36% of the total population are members of racial and ethnic minority groups, 50% of children born in the United States in 2011 were minorities, a figure that will continue to increase in the coming years. As shown in the table 3.1, birth rates among minority groups are higher than those of white Americans, and immigration patterns are contributing to the increasing size of the minority population. These national averages disguise the fact that minority groups are unequally distributed across the country. For example, minority groups are in the majority in California, Texas, New Mexico, Hawaii, and the District of Columbia, whereas minorities constitute less than 10% of the population in Maine, New Hampshire, Vermont, Iowa, and West Virginia. In the 47 urban school districts that constitute the great city schools include those in New York City, Los Angeles, and Chicago. An overwhelming majority of students are from minority groups. As might be expected with the increasing cultural diversity, teachers will encounter more students whose native language is not English and whose ethnic and cultural backgrounds reflect a different heritage. We discuss these English language learners later in this chapter. Students from biracial or multiracial backgrounds represent a small but growing segment of the U.S. population. These students often face unique issues such as being asked to declare a single race identity, thereby denying the rest of their heritage. Tiger Woods, an example of such an individual, declared himself to be a Cablinasian, a mixture of Caucasian, Black, American Indian, and Asian. Students without the international renown of Tiger Woods may face rejection from both members of mainstream culture and members of the racial or ethnic minority groups whose heritage they share. Teachers need to be aware of the difficulties such children may face and be willing to accept whatever identities the students choose for themselves. With the development of a richer, more varied society, differences in values and family expectations are also more evident. For people, some families may place a premium on school and higher education, whereas other families may emphasize early entry into the workplace. Even though you will encounter a range of familial expectations for school achievements, Be aware that all children deserve the best education experience they can get while in school. Recognition of racial and ethnic differences can provide the understanding and insight needed for more effective instruction. At one time, the United States was considered a melting pot of many different kinds of people. Immigrants were expected to give up the language and customs of their homelands and adopt the language and custom of their new country. During the 19th and early 20th centuries, schools contributed to the melting pot concept by socializing and acculturating immigrant children to American ways, while discouraging them from maintaining the ways of their homeland. Some states even passed laws forbidding instruction in any language but English. The basic idea was to produce a society with one dominant culture. The process of incorporating an immigration group. This process of incorporating an immigrant group into the mainstream culture is often referred to enculturation or assimilation. Many European immigrant groups were easily assimilated into the dominant American culture, but people of color were often prevented from doing so. The concept of the melting pot has generally been replaced by the notion of cultural pluralism, which calls for an understanding and appreciation of the cultural differences in languages among U.S. citizens. The goal is to create a sense of society's wholeness based on the unique strengths of each of its parts. Cultural pluralism rejects both assimilation and separatism, a philosophy that suggests each cultural group should maintain its own identity without trying to fit into an overall American culture. Instead, it seeks a healthy interaction among the diverse groups in our society. That is, each subculture maintains its own individuality while contributing to the society as a whole. As some commentators put it, cultural pluralism argues for replacing the melting pot with that of a mosaic tapestry or salad bowl, in which the individual parts remain distinct yet combine to make a unique whole. Many people have promulgated cultural pluralism as a desirable goal, but it does not currently exist in the United States. Although racial, ethnic, and cultural diversity do exist, equality among the various groups does not. In general, racial and ethnic minorities do not share equal political, economic, and educational opportunities with those of the dominant culture, even though our society espouses such equality. In addition, some people resist the notion of cultural pluralism as a desirable goal. Some opponents argue in favor of assimilation, contending that cultural pluralism will undermine the United States' common traditions historically derived from European cultures. Others favor separatism. Unfortunately, U.S. schools have often failed to support cultural pluralism. Traditionally, public schools have been run for the benefit of those in the dominant cultural group, thereby excluding minority groups from receiving the full range of benefits. Schools that embrace cultural pluralism seek to promote diversity and to avoid the dominance of a single culture. Their faculty and administration provide minority role models for students to interact with. Their curricula are infused with the histories and contributions of diverse groups. These schools attempt to use the cultural patterns of the students to provide instruction and promote learning. They may use the multicultural education approaches described next. The goal is for students to be comfortable operating with their own cultures and in other cultures as well. Students from all racial, ethnic, and cultural groups are urged to participate in the school's various social, athletic, and governmental activities. These schools seek to raise students from all racial, ethnic, and cultural groups to the highest academic standards. In short, the goal of schools that aim for cultural pluralism is that no particular multicultural group either dominates or is excluded from those activities and accomplishments that schools value. Multicultural education represents one approach to meeting the educational needs of an increasingly diverse student population. Multicultural education is an educational reform movement and a process whose major goal is to change the structure of educational institutions so that male and female students, exceptional students, and students who are members of diverse racial, ethnic, language, and cultural groups will have an equal chance to achieve academically in school. Spurred by the civil rights movement of the 1960s, multicultural education is a response to economic inequality, racism, and sexism in American culture. Originally used in conjunction with the notion of improving the lot of people of color, this term has since been broadened to include gender, ethnicity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, and other forms of diversity. At the heart of multicultural education is the belief that all students deserve a quality schooling experience. Its goals include reducing prejudice and fostering tolerance, improving the academic achievement of all students, building commitment to the American ideas of pluralism and democracy, and incorporating diverse groups' perspectives into the curricula of our schools. Like the concept of cultural pluralism on which it is based, multicultural education rejects both the notion of the melting pot and separatist philosophies. At least 5 different approaches to multicultural education have been identified, which helps explain why the term often has a very different meaning for different people. Teaching the exceptional and culturally different helps students achieve academically and socially within currently existing schools by building bridges between the students' backgrounds and the students to make the curriculum more accessible to all. Human relations attempt to develop cultural awareness and positive relations among members of diverse groups. Single group studies focus on programs that examine particular groups such as African American studies or women's studies. Multicultural approaches promote cultural pluralism by reconstructing the whole educational process around the perspectives of diverse racial, ethnic, cultural, and social causes. Multicultural social justice teaches students to examine inequality and oppression in society and take action to remediate those inequalities. Multicultural education is not just for members of minority, racial, or ethnic groups, rather it is for all students. A major goal of multicultural education is to help students from diverse cultures learn to cross cultural borders and to participate in a diverse democratic society. True multicultural education does not consist of only Black History or Women's History Month. Instead of simply adding information about particular groups to the curriculum and leaving the rest of it untouched, real multicultural education presents multiple perspectives and viewpoints to help students understand how various groups can interpret events and facts differently. In addition to valuing cultural diversity, multicultural education is based on the concept of social justice, which seeks to do away with the social and economic inequalities for those who in the past have been denied these benefits of a democratic society. African Americans, American Indians, Asian Americans, Hispanic Americans, mixed race individuals, women, individuals with disabilities, people with limited English proficiency, people with low incomes, members of a particular religion group, and individuals with different sexual orientations are among those groups that have at one time or another been denied social justice. Educators who support multicultural education see establishing social justice for all people, but particularly for those who have experienced discrimination as a moral and ethical responsibility. Many school districts are attempting to permeate their curricula with a multicultural emphasis, believing that attention to multicultural education is the best way to combat the prejudice and diverseness among that many different believing that attention to multicultural education is the best way to combat the prejudice and diverseness the prejudice and divisiveness among that many different subcultures found in the United States. It counteracts what some call subtractive schooling, or the notion that schools divest diverse students of their cultural resources, leaving them destined for academic failure. By developing mutual respect for and appreciation of different lifestyles, languages, religions, beliefs, and family structures, students may help shape a better future society for all of its members. Some educators, however, are concerned about what they believe are potential dangers of multicultural education in the schools. Multicultural education may destroy any sense of common tradition, values, purposes, and obligations, thereby leading to a more fragmented and continuous nation. It may divert schools' attention from the basic purpose of education for civic, economic, and personal effectiveness. It attacks the problems of minority students' underachievement by emphasizing self-esteem rather than hard work. It substitutes relevance of subjects studied for instructions in solid academics. It may undermine a sense of common morality because some advocates of multiculturalism claim there are no universal moral positions that the public schools can legitimately teach. These critics do not argue against the need to preserve and value the achievements of the diverse ethnic and racial groups of the United States, but they reject the position that everything is of equal value, that the schools have a responsibility to teach every possible belief and value, and that behavior is moral if it is believed to be so by any group. They assert that there are limits to pluralism and that those limits must be articulated by schools and school leaders. In addition, these critics believe that those who lose most from multicultural education are the minorities and immigrants themselves. They argue that the special curricular accommodations associated with multicultural education divert time and energy away from the subjects the students need to compete in the economic world dominated by the majority culture. Other critics of multiculturalism completely reject the concept of cultural pluralism, preferring an assimilationist perspective whereby schools are charged with forging one dominant American culture in which English is only acceptable language. Clearly, the notion of multicultural education is not without controversy. Multicultural education has often been cast as a reform movement designed to address inequities and discrimination resulting from the race, religion, socioeconomic status, gender, age, exceptionability, or language of students. As with any attempt to solve social problems, excess and over-exuberance can occur. Nonetheless, schools do need to accommodate diverse populations in a way that removes barriers and enables those students to compete academically with to compete academically and economically while preserving the basic purposes of schooling. One preferred method for teachers who want to acknowledge and embrace cultural diversity in the classroom is culturally responsive teaching. Many educators have documented how cultural identity, communication styles, and social expectations of students from minority cultural groups often conflict with the values, beliefs, and cultural assumptions of the teachers. These schools' dominant culture often places students from other cultures at a disadvantage in understanding the school's cultural codes and communication styles. Teachers who recognize this problem can implement an equity pedagogy, a style of teaching that uses instructional materials and practices that incorporate important aspects of their students' families and community culture. Creating a welcome and safe learning environment begins with awareness. Teachers and administrators must have an awareness of who their students are. Teachers should develop cultural knowledge and build an inclusive school climate. To develop a cultural awareness begins with exploring your own background and considering how it is like and different from others. Ask yourself some important questions. How do your race, ethnicity, culture, and other aspects of your identity influence your perspectives on school? How do you think these perspectives might be different from a student with a background different than your own? How are your notions of school and learning impacted by your cultural background? How might these perceptions differ from a student who is growing up in a different family than yours? Investing time into getting to know your students and their backgrounds will help you better craft instruction for diverse learners in your classroom. To foster a cultural understanding of those different from you, attend a cultural event that is different than one you typically attended. Reflect on how it made you feel, what you learned, and how it makes you feel about teaching a diverse class of students. Students often are forced to navigate dual worlds, their school world and their home world. Schools that honor diversities do not ask students to check their cultural backpacks at the front door of the school. Rather, they build on students' funds of knowledge or their cultural valued knowledge. Teachers who teach in a culturally relevant classroom use student-centered stories and examples in their own teacher. One example of cultural relevant teaching is selecting culturally diverse nonfiction when reading nonfiction. Families by Anne Morris is one example of an early elementary informational text that prompts young children to learn about diversity of families and family structures around the world. Another example is teaching World War II from American-centric perspective and from the Japanese-American perspective. Just as schools embrace multiculturalism, they must also embrace multilingualism. 10% of students in schools are English language learners, meaning they have limited English proficiency. Yet less than 1% of classroom teachers are trained to teach those students. Nearly 400 different languages are spoken in U.S. homes. Spanish is the most common home language for ELLs. French, German, Chinese, Korean, Vietnamese, and Tagalog are the next languages that ELLs most frequently speak at home. You might think that these non-English speaking youngsters are new to the United States, and some of them are. However, 80% of the children of these immigrants were born in the United States, and approximately 3/4 of the ELLs were born in the United States, are U.S. citizens, and began school in kindergarten and first grade, and the same as their English-speaking peers. The remaining 1/4 of the ELLs include immigrant children and youth born in a country other than the United States. Some of these students are refugees from another country. Refugees are individuals who are permitted to enter the United States because they have fled their native country due to possible harm. The federal government determines how many refugees may enter the United States each year. It is important to note that about 40% of the refugees entering the United States are children who enter our schools. These data indicate that the predominant need for English language development instruction in the U.S. proficiency system in the U.S. school systems is for a large native-born population that does not speak English proficiently. Students whose native language is not English constitute one of the most conspicuous failure groups in the U.S. educational system. Because of their difficulty in speaking, writing, and understanding English, many of these ELL students fall farther and farther behind in school, and overwhelmingly numbers drop out before finishing high school. To address this problem, Congress passed the Bilingual Education Act in 1968 and subsequently amended it a number of times to provide federal funds to develop bilingual programs. Passage of the legislation signaled momentous changes for ELL students in our schools and signified changing perspectives about diversity in schools. Much of the expansion of bilingual programs in the 1970s can be attributed to a series of court cases that guided the legislation through different iterations. Perhaps most significant of those cases were the 1974 U.S. Supreme Court of Lau versus Nichols, in which the court found that where inability to speak and understand the English language excludes national origin minority group children from effective participation in the educational program offered by school district, and the district must take children from effective participation in the educational group offered by a school district. The district must take affirmative steps to rectify the language deficiency in order to open its instructional program for these students. Basing its ruling on the Civil Rights of 1964, the court held that San Francisco school system unlawfully discriminated on the basis of national origin when it failed to cope with a child's language problems. As a result of the Lau case, the U.S. Office for Civil Rights suggested guidelines for school districts to follow, the so-called Lau remedies. The guidelines specified language minority students should be taught academics in their primary home language until they could effectively benefit from English language instruction. The legislation continued to evolve in a way that reflected changing attitudes about diversity and immigration. In 1994, the Bilingual Education Act was further revised to advocate toward the goal of bilingualism for ELL students. Title III of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act provides for federal grant money to state education agencies for the purposes of helping to ensure that limited English proficient children develop high levels of academic attainment in English and meet the same student academic achievement standards as all children are expected to meet. Title III provides more than $750 million a year to states, distributed proportionately based on the number of ELLs in each state. No Child Left Behind. Although the No Child Left Behind Act doesn't specify what kind of instruction schools should use for ELL students, many school districts have discontinued bilingual education in such cases for three primary reasons. Accountability tests are typically in English, the heavy financial demands of the program, and more time is needed for English instruction than for instruction of a student's native language. As might be expected, ELL students do not do as well on the test as native English-speaking students. Students with a native language other than English have two goals in school: learning English and mastering content. Language programs for ELLs are two types. Those that focus on developing literacy in two languages, and those that focus on developing literacy in only English. Among the models that focus on developing literacy in two languages are the transitional and maintenance or developmental models. The transitional model provides intensive English language instruction, but students get some portion of their academic instruction in their native language. The goal is to prepare students for regular classes in English without letting them fall behind in subject areas. In theory, students should transition out of these programs within a few years. Maintenance or developmental bilingual education aims to preserve and build on the students' native language as they continue to acquire English as a second language. A recent trend in many schools has been to offer two-way dual language education tracks for both ELL students and native English-speaking students. The two groups of students are combined in one class. Instruction is in English for part of the day and in another language for at least half the day. Often these school programs are grounded in the philosophy that all students should be bilingual. Research on two-way dual language programs reports that reading and math scores are higher for all students. In the English immersion model, students learn everything in English. Teachers using immersion programs generally strive to deliver lessons in simple and understandable language that allows students to internalize English while learning academic subjects. The extreme case of immersion is called submersion, wherein students must sink or swim until they learn English. Sometimes students are pulled out for English as a second language programs, which provide them with instruction in English geared towards learning acquisition. Choosing the best method for educating students who need to learn English has become a diverse political battle. In the early 1970s, language minority speakers and their advocates fought for bilingual education as their right. Today, however, many of them are expressing doubts about the effectiveness of bilingual programs. Civil rights and cultural issues are giving way to concerns that non-native English speakers are just not sufficiently mastering the English language, which in turn is keeping them from fully participating in American life. Although many educators believe students who use English as a second language should be educated in their native language as well, critics insist such an approach doesn't work. Critics believe that the best path to academic achievement for language minority students is, in most cases, is to learn English and learn it quickly. Too many bilingual programs, they say, place ELL students into slower learning tracks where they rarely learn sufficient English and from which they can never emerge. These critics basically support an immersion model of bilingual education, opposing the transitional and maintenance models. In response, supporters of traditional and maintenance models argue that students can best keep up academically with their English-speaking peers if they are taught at least partially in their native languages while learning English. They also cite research indicating that instruction in the native language concurrent with English instruction actually enhances the acquisition of English. These advocates say it's not fair to blame bilingual education for the slow progress that some students are making. The true problem is that becoming proficient in any second language takes longer than just 1 or 2 years. They also point out the shortage of well-qualified, fully bilingual teachers, which in many cases means that the problem with bilingual classes is not the curriculum, but rather the quality of the instruction. Some school systems have used para-educators who speak the child's language to help connect the child and the school. The use of bilingual peer tutors also may help provide a greater sense of stability. The transitional and maintenance models of bilingual education are in growing jeopardy. First, California, Arizona, and Massachusetts gutted their bilingual programs, and now other states are threatening to follow suit. In 1998, California voters passed Proposition 227, which called for ELL students to be taught in a special English immersion program in which nearly all instruction is in English, in most cases for no more than a year, before moving into mainstream English classrooms. Proposition 227 basically ended transitional and maintenance models for bilingual education in California, except when sufficient numbers of parents specifically request that their child continue in them. Many parents, administrators, and teachers are concerned that all children, not just EL students, will be affected as mainstream teachers grapple with students who may be unprepared to deal with grade level work in English after 1 year in immersion. The legality of Proposition 227 was changed in the courts, but in 2001 a federal appeals court upheld the law. ELL students in California elementary and middle school have improved their overall scores on the state standardized testing since the implementation of Proposition 227, an outcome that supporters of the measure argue is a result of the law being implemented. On the other side of the coin, bilingual education supporters point out the average scores have risen for all students in California, but note that the rate of increase in scores for EL students still lags behind the rate increase for English-speaking students. Although research on the effectiveness of bilingual education remains controversial, in a recent study in which English language learners were followed for as long as 5 years, researchers found that Spanish-speaking children learn to read English equally well, regardless of whether they are taught primarily in English or in both English and their native language. Despite the controversy over bilingual education, many school districts are in desperate need of bilingual teachers, partially those who speak Spanish, particularly those who speak Spanish and Asian languages. If you speak a second language or still have time to include learning a language in your college program, you could help meet a serious educational need while greatly enhancing your employment opportunities. Speaking a foreign language, especially Spanish, is also an asset for regular classroom teachers who may have Spanish-speaking students in class. The changing demographic trends in the United States make it quite likely you will teach bilingual students in your classroom. How you will ensure you're effectively instructing these students in a way that they can best learn? One of the first things you should do is get to know your students and develop an understanding of their cultural and language background. It will be helpful for you to know how long the students have been speaking English and what language is spoken at home. From the beginning, you can assign a buddy student to partner with ELL students on classroom activities. Encourage the students to engage in authentic and meaningful communication. As you consider your instruction, structure lessons that activate and build knowledge with pictures, videos, and graphic organizers. Engage students in cooperation learning activities so that they can support one another and learn together. When talking with students, be sure to give some extra time for them to respond and be sure to model correct English usage. Other modifications or strategies you may incorporate in your classroom for EL students may include vocabulary notebooks, topical word walls, and dialogue journals. Among the modifications that have been shown not to work include asking another student to translate assignments into the student's native language, providing extra time for the assignment with no added instruction or explanation, or excusing the student from doing an assignment. In some ways, many U.S. schools are not structured to address students' diverse abilities. In this section, we look at the theory that students may have many abilities and talents not tapped by traditional schooling. We also explore learning styles to see how different students learn. This exploration might broaden your views on approaches to teaching. Finally, we briefly examine characteristics of students along a range of disabilities and talents. Schools and teachers must make special efforts to effectively educate students who vary from average, either because they have learning problems or because they are academically gifted. Howard Gardner, a leading psychologist, proposes that we should move towards educating multiple intelligences, of which linguistic and analytical abilities are only two facets. In Gardner's book, Frames of a Mind and Multiple Intelligence, the Theory and Practice, he explains that we all have strengths, weaknesses, and unique combinations of cognitive abilities. Gardner states that people have at least 8 distinct intellectual capacities that they use to approach problems and create products. Verbal linguistic intelligence draws on the individual's language skills, oral and written, to express what's on the person's mind and to understand other people. Logical mathematic intelligence is a person's ability to understand principles of some kind of causal system, like a scientist does, or to manipulate numbers, quantities, and operations like a mathematician does. Spatial intelligence refers to the ability to represent the spatial world internally in the mind, like a chess player or a sculptor does. Bodily kinesthetic intelligence is the capacity to use your whole body or parts of your body to solve a problem, make something, or put on some kind of production, like that of an athlete or performing artist. Musical intelligence is the capacity to think in music and be able to hear patterns and recognize, remember, and manipulate them. Interpersonal intelligence is the ability to understand other people and the ability that we all need, but this is particularly important for teachers, salespeople, and politicians. Intrapersonal intelligence refers to having an understanding of yourself and knowing your preferences, capabilities, and deficiencies. Naturalist intelligence refers to the ability to discriminate among living things and to have sensitivity towards features of their natural world, such as rock formations and clouds. He has also tentatively identified a ninth intelligence, existential intelligence. Existential intelligence refers to the ability to pose and ponder questions about life, death, and ultimate realities. Many of our schools tend to emphasize a curriculum that specifically targets the predominantly linguistic and mathematical abilities students need to do well on commonly used standardized testing, and to de-emphasize or exclude other possible intelligences. This constricted focus on a limited range of abilities results in an education system that teaches and reinforces only certain types of achievement. Children who are strong in linguistic and logical mathematical tasks are likely to be successful in school and feel a great sense of achievement. Other children, even though they may be very competent or even gifted in non-traditional school tasks, may experience frustration or failure in school. In Gardner's theory, abilities in diverse areas would be valued as indicators of intelligence and be considered worthy of further nurturance and development in the school. Howard Gardner's book, 5 Minds of the Future, Cultivating Thinking Skills, argues that because the future is so unpredictable and changing, everyone needs to cultivate 5 different ways of thinking. The disciplined mind has mastered at least one way of thinking, a distinctive mode of cognition that characterizes a specific scholarly discipline, craft, or profession. The synthesizing mind takes information from disparate sources, understands and evaluates the information objectively, and puts it together in ways that make sense to the synthesizer and also to other people. The creative mind breaks new ground. It puts forth new ideas, poses unfamiliar questions, conjures up fresh ways of thinking, and arrives at unexpected answers. The respectful mind notes and welcomes differences among human individuals and groups, tries to understand these others, and seeks to work effectively with them. The ethical mind ponders the nature of one's work and works in the needs and desires of the society in which one lives. This mind conceptualizes how workers can serve purpose beyond self-interest and how citizens can work unselfishly to improve the lot of all. These 5 minds are different from the 8 or 9 intelligence Gardner identified. He thinks of them as broad uses of the mind that can be cultivated in school, the workplace, or in professions. To be certain, Gardner asserts these 5 minds make use of intelligences. For instance, to cultivate the respectful mind, one would have to exercise interpersonal intelligence, or to be cultivate the disciplined mind, logical, mathematical intelligence is likely to be used. Acknowledging and fostering individual abilities in a variety of areas is one way teachers can help students. To address varied intelligences, Gardner emphasizes learning in context, particularly through apprenticeships. Student development in an area like music should be fostered through hands-on practice and experiences. Even traditional subjects should be taught in a variety of ways, such as those listed in the multiple intelligence menu in Table 3.2, to address the varied intelligence of both students and teachers. For example, a history might be taught through a number of media and methods ranging from art and architecture to biographies and dramatic reenactments of events. Assessments should be tailored to different abilities and should take place in a learning context as much as possible. Although the theory of multiple intelligences is very popular with many educators and resonates with their own experiences, it should be noted that a number of psychologists have criticized it based on the lack of scientific measure for Gardner's various intelligences. Some critics argue that what Gardner calls intelligences are merely talents, personality traits, or cognitive styles. Others worry that schools, in the attempt to address a range of abilities, may not adequately stress the importance of verbal and mathematical abilities, which they say are critical to success in our society. In particular, some critics worry that Gardner's theories will lead to the end of ability grouping in school. Nevertheless, multiple intelligence theories offers teachers some ideas for expanding instructional repertoires and infusing variety into lessons. It provides a framework for enhancing instruction and a language to describe the efforts. Gardner recommends that teachers be mindful of multiple intelligence as they craft their instructions. Using them as framework can assist teachers in individualizing their instruction and pluralizing their teaching. With the range of diversity your students will display, some will have disabilities. You may encounter many types of disabilities. For example, you may have students with mental retardation, emotional disturbance, learning disabilities, attention deficit disorders, speech or language impairments, multiple handicaps, autism, traumatic brain injuries, orthopedic impairments, visual impairments or blindness, and hearing impairments or deafness. Nearly 10% of all school-age children are identified to have a specific disability. Table 3.3 shows the percentage of students in each of the officially recognized categories by race. The term special education is often used as a designation for services designed for students with disabilities. In 1975, the Education for All Handicapped Children Act established the right for all students with disabilities to a free, appropriate public education. The law specified that each such student must be provided with an individual education program outlining both long-range and short-range goals for the child. Since that time, a number of other federal laws have reinforced and extended the commitment to special education. The Education of the Handicapped Act amendments passed in 1986 provided for an early intervention for children from birth to age 2 who are developmentally delayed. For states that choose to participate, programs must include a multidisciplinary assessment for the child's needs, a written individualized family service plan, and a case management. Services may draw from a variety of areas such as special education, speech and language pathology, occupational or physical therapy, or family training and counseling, depending on the developmental needs of the child. PL 99-457 also stated that FAPE must be extended to children with disabilities aged 3 to 5. Although state and local education agencies administer these programs, they may contract with other programs, agencies, or providers to supply a range of services, such as programs that are home-based for part of the day. Families play a particularly important role in preschool education, and instruction for parents is to be included in the IFSP whenever it is appropriate and the parents desire it. When students reach school age, they are covered by the provisions of Individuals with Disability Act, as discussed in the next section. In 1990, Congress passed 2 significant federal laws relating to people with disabilities. The Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, subsequently reauthorized in 1997 and again in 2004, and the American with Disabilities Act, IDEA amended the Education for All Handicapped Children Act in 1975. ADA ensures the right of the individual with disabilities to non-discriminatory treatment in aspects of their lives other than education. 7 principles provide the framework of IDEA around which education services are designed and provided to students with disabilities. Fair and appropriate education, appropriate evaluation, an individualized education program, least restrictive environment, parent and student participation in decision-making, procedural safeguards, response to intervention. Because of the wide variety of disabilities and infinite degrees of severity in which these conditions may be found in individual students, IDEA mandates that a free, appropriate public education be defined on an individual basis using the written IEP. The IEP identifies the child's current level of education performance, short-term objectives, and annual goals, services to be provided, and criteria and schedules for evaluation of progress. In this way, it helps ensure that the educational goals designed for the child are appropriate to his or her individual learning needs, and that these plans are actually delivered as intended. Provisions in the IEP must be reviewed and revised annually or more often if necessary. Teachers, parents or guardians, special educators, other professionals, and the child, whenever appropriate, are involved in the development and approval of the IEP. IDEA also requires that all older students with disabilities, usually 14 to 16, have an individualized plan for making transition from school to work or additional education beyond high school through age 21. Like the original Act of 1975, the IDEA further stipulates that service for students with disabilities be provided in a least restrictive environment, meaning students with disabilities should be educated with children without disabilities to the greatest extent appropriate. Determination of what constitutes the LRE has been controversial. The social and academic benefits of the regular classroom must be weighed against the unique educational needs and individual circumstances for each child. In the past, the term mainstreaming was used to describe the practice of placing special education students in general education classes for at least part of the school day, with additional services, programs, or classes being provided to the students as needed. More recently, the term inclusion has been used to mean the commitment to educate each child to the maximum extent appropriate in the regular school and classroom. Compared with mainstreaming, inclusion, and particularly full inclusion, as it is sometimes called, indicates an even greater commitment to keeping students with disabilities in regular classrooms. This usually involves bringing the support services to the child rather than moving the child to services located in separate rooms or building. Controversy over inclusion. In recent years, full inclusion has become a civil rights issue. Advocates of full inclusion argue that segregated education for students with disability is inherently unequal and therefore violates the rights of these children. They also argue that traditional special education programs have resulted in a costly special education bureaucracy that has not shown the expected benefits in terms of academic, social, or vocational skills. Among the benefits of full inclusion for children with disabilities, they say, are higher expectations of better socialization, as well as greater acceptance of human differences by children without disabilities. The up-close feature describes how one teacher has learned about the student with autism in her classroom. Critics of full inclusion say that both teachers and students are being hurt in the rush to embrace this teaching approach. Parents of children without disabilities often worry that curriculum standards will be lowered by the inclusion of students with learning disabilities and those students with ADHD or emotional problems can be a disruption to their classmates and teachers. Some special educators voice concerns that full inclusion may result in a diminished or inadequate specialized services for students who have special needs. They point out that the regular classroom may not be the best setting for every child. Violent or emotionally distorted children, for example, may pose a threat to themselves and to their classmates. These educators are often wary of eliminating the range of service delivery options currently available in favor of a pure inclusion model. They argue that little evidence shows that inclusion programs strengthen students' academic achievement. Overworked classroom teachers have complained that they are given inadequate resources and training to deal with students with disabilities. Ideally, when students with disabilities are included in regular classrooms, their teachers receive special training and help from a special education teacher who serves as either a co-teacher or a consultant. In some cases, however, teachers have been given sole responsibility for a class of 30 students, with as many as 10 having disabilities. True collaboration between general education and special education teachers is essential for all inclusion to work effectively. In too many instances, critics say, when children with disabilities are moved from resource rooms and self-contained classrooms into regular classrooms, the necessary supports do not follow them on their journey. One reason for this trend is that some school districts use the cover of inclusion as a way to cut costs for special education services. With voters reluctant to increase school taxes and many school districts facing budget cuts as a result, some school boards and administrations see the inclusion movement as a way to save money by reducing funding for special education. In 2004, reauthorization of IDEA committed the federal government in principle to paying 40% of the average per pupil cost of educating a special education student in 2011. A little over 13% of school-aged children are served by programs for students with disabilities. Unfortunately, in 2012, the federal government provided approximately 17% of its commitment rather than the 40% specified by law. The development is especially important because in 2001, No Child Left Behind Act requires that special education students take the same achievement test with regular education students, albeit sometimes with accommodations. Without funding or appropriate alternative assessments, many special education students will not pass these tests, and their school will fail to meet provisions for the law. For more on the No Child Left Behind, see Chapter 11 in Chapter 12. Despite the criticisms of the inclusion movement, one thing is certain: inclusion of children with disabilities has become accepted practice in the U.S. schools. The majority of schools with disabilities are taking part in regular The majority of students with disabilities are taking part in regular classrooms and school life alongside their peers. Inclusion seems to thrive in schools that have shared vision of the school's purpose, strong lines of communication among teachers, administrators, and parents, and a culture of innovation and reform. In many schools with successful inclusion programs, the presence of students with disabilities has sparked other reform initiatives, such as cooperative learning, peer teaching, team teaching, authentic assessment, and interdisciplinary instruction. In addition, the students receiving special education services a number of children in elementary and secondary schools have 504 plans. The 504 and 504 plans refer to Section 504 in the Rehabilitation Act and the Americans with Disabilities Act, which specifies that no one with a disability can be excluded from participating in federally funded programs or activities, including elementary, secondary, or post-secondary schooling. Disability in this context refers to physical or mental impairment, which substantially limits one or more major life activities. This can include physical impairment, illness or injury, communicable disease, chronic conditions like asthma, allergies, and diabetes, and learning problems. A 504 plan spells out the accommodations that will be needed for these students to have an opportunity to perform at the same level as their peers. It might include things as wheelchair ramps, blood sugar monitoring, an extra set of textbooks, peanut-free lunch environment, home instruction, or a tape recorder or keyboard for taking notes. In 2004, reauthorization of IDEA, a new term and concept response to intervention, was introduced. The purpose of RTI is to catch struggling children early, provide appropriate instruction, and prevent the need to refer the child for special education. The U.S. Department of Education permits school districts to use up to 15% of their IDEA funding for early intervention services and regular education. RTI is a tiered process for instruction that permits schools to identify struggling students early and to provide appropriate instructional interventions. By intervening early, students will experience a greater chance of success and less need for special education services. Although there are several models of intervention, typically a child would move from Tier 1 general education to Tier 2 more target small group interventions, and if necessary to Tier 3 where the student would receive additional support and individualized attention. RTI is designed to increase the percentage of children who can pass the NCLB state test in reading and math. Just as many students use contact lenses or glasses to help them compensate for poor eyesight, so students with disabilities may rely on a variety of technology-based innovations to help them learn better. The term assistive technology refers to the array of devices and services that help people with disabilities perform better in their daily lives. Devices such as motorized chairs, remote control units to turn on appliances, voice recognition systems, ramps to enter and exit buildings, and computers or tablets can all assist people with severe disabilities. Computers are especially important in allowing many students with a range of disabilities to participate in normal class activities that would otherwise be impossible. We discuss this more in Chapter 7. Congress incorporated definitions of assistive technology into IDEA, declaring that such technology must be provided whenever necessary as an element of free and appropriate public education. Assistive technology must be considered a potential component of the IEP for each student with disabilities. As a new teacher, you should be prepared to encounter situations in which a child uses technology as a medium for interaction and engagement in your classroom. If you are a regular education teacher, students with disabilities will likely be in your classroom for varying portions of the school day, depending on the types and amount of support services they are receiving. How will you deal with different needs? How will you deal with the different needs of these children? It is important that you do not stereotype these students. Certainly, different disabilities will have different implications for student learning. For example, a student with mental retardation may require repetition and practice to master simple concepts, whereas a student who uses a wheelchair may learn the most difficult materials quickly. Even with the parameters of each type of disability, however, you will probably encounter a wide range of differences. Consider two students identified as having learning disabilities. One may display a low average intelligence quotient. One may display a low to average IQ and have extreme difficulty in math. The other may have an extremely high IQ and have a difficulty in reading. Although both of these students have learning disabilities, you would not provide the same instruction or have the same expectations for both children. You should approach instruction for children with disabilities just as you would for other students in the classroom. Expect diversity, anticipate a range of abilities, and look for particular strengths and learning profiles of each student. The special education teachers in your school will be helpful resources for recognizing student abilities and suggesting instructional strategies. The more you and a special education teacher can coordinate instruction and service for your students with disabilities, the better students' education experience are likely to be. Here are a few other suggestions about how you as a regular education teacher can be effective in teaching children with disabilities in your classroom. Be open to the idea of including students with disabilities in your room. Learn about each child's limitations and potential and about available curriculum methodologies and technologies to help the child learn. Insist that any needed services be provided. Use a variety of teaching strategies, including hands-on activities, peer tutoring, and cooperative learning strategies. Avail yourself for opportunities for co-teaching with special education teachers. One of the most challenging types of students are gifted or talented children. The term talented most often refers to an ability or skill that may not be matched by the child's more general abilities, whereas the term gifted usually includes intellectual ability. Gifted children are extremely bright, quickly grasping the ideas and concepts you are teaching and making interpretations or extrapolations that you may not even have considered. Gifted children may also have a creativity that shows itself in original thinking or artistic creations. Students who are gifted and or talented are sometimes overlooked when educators talk about students with special needs. Although special education care and service for students with disabilities have long been recognized and accepted, American education has been slow to accept the notion that gifted children require special adaptations in both curricula and teaching methods, because the idea of giftedness implies an elitism to many Americans. It seems undemocratic to provide special services to a child who already enjoy an intellectual advantage. However, As one educator says, highly gifted children are as far from the norm in the direction of giftedness as the severely retarded in the other direction. When their special needs are neglected, gifted and talented students drop out of school at rates far exceeding the dropout rates of those not identified as gifted. Many of those students who stay in school feel unchallenged and become bored and apathetic. As a result, many of our brightest and most talented minds are being turned off or underdeveloped. However, many school districts have made serious efforts to identify gifted children and provide special programs for them. The areas in which states identify gifted and talented students can range from intellectual to psychomotor to artistic, with many variations. Though its evolution, the study of giftedness has moved increasingly towards toward more inclusive definitions and away from more exclusive ones. As we described earlier in the chapter, some people now think intelligence is composed of multiple factors. Consequently, in many schools, the definition of giftedness is shifted away from the emphasis on general IQ and toward the recognition that giftedness occurs in a variety of areas such as mathematical, language, spatial ability, and kinesthetics. In the past, school districts have tended to rely heavily on general intelligence and achievement tests in their assessment of students' intellectual abilities, as well as on teacher recommendation in grades earned in school. There is a danger of letting these assessment tools become synonymous with the definition of gifted and talented. To avoid this danger, teachers and administrators must study and interpret the data that tools provide rather than take the data at face value and use them for hard and fast cutoff points. Whether to recommend a child for a special program is a decision that should be made by responsible teachers and other professional educators on the basis of their objective and subjective appraisals of the student, the nature of the gifted program or activity, and the atmosphere in which the student lives and goes to school. Parents should be a significant part of these discussions. The point is that the complexity of their variables requires that professionals make individual decisions using their best judgment rather than according to arbitrary predetermined cutoff points on tests. A major concern in the identification of gifted and talented students centers on the underrepresentation of economically disadvantaged students. The students with learning disabilities and certain minority students. A major concern of the identification of gifted and talented students centers on the underrepresentation of economically disadvantaged students, students with learning disabilities, and certain minority students. Asian American students are well represented in gifted and talented programs, whereas African American and Hispanic students are underrepresented in terms of their proportion in the total school population. Given this disparity, educators and parents are concerned that the measures being used to identify gifted and talented youngsters may work to the disadvantage of African American, Hispanics, and children of low-income families. Conversely, African American students are overrepresented in special education services, leading many educators and parents to wonder whether some form of cultural or racial bias is at work. The problem of identification is especially acute for bilingual children and children adjusting to a new culture. Programs for gifted and talented students exist in every state and are in many school districts. The federal government reports that 3.2 million students were identified as gifted and talented in public elementary and secondary schools, representing about 6.7% of the total enrollment. The two main strategies for serving gifted children are acceleration and enrichment. With an accelerated curriculum, gifted children can learn at a pace commensurate with their abilities, allowing them to progress to advanced material faster than the age norms or grade level. By contrast, enrichment activities provide gifted students with the opportunities to go beyond the regular curriculum in greater depth and breadth. To engage in independent or collaborative inquiry that develops them problem-solving abilities, research skills, and creativity. Current educational programs for gifted and talented students are quite often varied. Some programs establish special schools that are designed only for gifted or talented students and have special admission requirements. In such schools, stimulating courses can be devised and taught without concern for students who might be unable to keep pace, and teachers and students can be recruited on the basis of their talents. Other programs adapt and enrich the regular school curriculum for gifted and talented children by grouping these students together for all or part of their instruction. This option is normally more flexible and practical than establishing special schools. Classes can be established on a continuing or short-term basis in any subject area, with the intention of either enriching or accelerating for the student. In the United States, most gifted and talented students are likely to receive all or nearly all of their education in regular classrooms. In many school districts, in fact, separate programs for gifted students are being curtailed or phased out. The primary reason for this trend are the spread of philosophy that favors mixed abilities grouping, the cessation of tracking, and a lack of funds for separate gift programs. In fact, the federal government does not fund gifted education programs or services. Some states, but not all, allocate funds to support gifted education. The trend toward meeting gifted student needs with the regular classroom parallels the inclusion movement in special education. Some advocates for gifted education programs are distributed by this trend and suggest that gifted students will be shortchanged in the regular classroom. They fear that teachers will concentrate their efforts on struggling students, or that gifted students will be drafted to serve as tutors for these students rather than working to fulfill their own potential. Supporters of the current trend, however, believe the most gifted students' needs can be met in a regular classroom if teachers can differentiate curricula and instruction for them and increase the level of challenge. Still others argue that it is important to keep continuum of programs and services available for gifted students, if for no other reason that they represent a valuable resource to the United States. Although with instruction in the regular classroom, these educators argue the options for such students should include pull-out program, special classes, grade skipping, and separate centers in schools. A range of giftedness exists such that some students will do just fine in a regular classroom, whereas others can benefit from different programs. If you want to focus on teaching gifted students, find out whether your state is one of the 20 or so that requires teachers to obtain a gifted endorsement to their teaching license. More likely, you will discover certain students in your regular education class to be gifted or talented and lacking any special program. You will be responsible for teaching these students as part of your normal duties, and if your school or school district has special programs for gifted and talented students, you may be expected to work with the resource teacher to help prepare individualized education plans for these students. What do you need to know? Recognize that gifted pupils generally learn standard curricular skills and content quickly and easily. They need teaching that does not tie them to a limited range. That is not preoccupied with filling them with facts and information, but rather allows them to use regular class as a forum for research, inquiry, or projects that are meaningful to them. Realize that these students are persistent, curious. They need teachers who encourage them to maintain confidence in their own ideas, even when those ideas differ from the norm. Teach these pupils to be efficient and effective at independent study so they can develop skills required for self-directed learning and for analyzing and solving problems independently. Allow students of varying abilities to work together in an area of high interest, such as social action research projects. Help students apply complex cognitive process such as creative thinking, critiques, and pro and con analysis. Expand your ideas concerning which instructional materials are available. Consider business, religious groups, national parks, and resource people as sources of potential instruction material in addition to the textbook and reference books available in school. Be sure to investigate any technological resources that are available, including websites and other electronic links to information and knowledge people outside of school. Use differentiated instruction strategies such as flexible group tiered assignments, learning centers, student contracts, and mentorships. Implement curriculum compacting, in which teachers test students on what they already know on upcoming units. Students who demonstrate mastery in advance are allowed to accelerate through the mastered or pursue enrichment activities while the unit is being taught to the rest of the class. Match students with mentors to help develop talent. Engage students in relevant and applied problem solving. Mentoring programs encourage independent growth, increase self-consciousness, confidence, and willingness to reach out to new, untried areas. Earlier in this chapter, we made the point that some racial and ethnic groups have been denied equal education opportunities. Throughout our country's history, another group, women, have also suffered discrimination and denial of equal education opportunities. Historically, women in our society have been denied educational and employment opportunities routinely extended to men. In recent years, considerable progress has been made to address these inequities. For example, women now constitute the majority of college students and have gained admittance into and success with many professions from which they were previously excluded. Teachers must be alert to avoid unfairness in the treatment of either boys or girls. Fairness and equality must be difficult to achieve, however, because by the time they get to school, boys and girls are already used to being treated differently. From very young ages through adulthood, society holds different expectations for males and females. These expectations, in turn, generate different patterns of behavior toward boys and girls, whether it is pink or blue clothes, G.I. Joe or Barbie dolls, video games or drawing kits, football helmets or ballet slippers. Boys and girls get different messages from society about what is expected of them. Society tolerates aggressive behavior more in boys than girls. Boys are encouraged to be independent, whereas girls are often expected to conform to accept norms. During the 1980s and 90s, a number of research studies alleged that girls were being shortchanged in schools and classrooms. Researchers concluded that teachers often treated boys differently than girls, frequently to the girls' detriment. Although teachers were generally unaware of their behavior that favored boys, these research studies suggested that in a subtle and not so subtle ways, female students received the message that boys were more important because teachers paid more attention to boys. Researchers also found there were considerable gender stereotyping in textbooks and other reading material. Great strides have been made to level the playing field for girls and boys in the classroom. Today, a majority of college graduates are women. Girls have caught up with boys in terms of mathematics and science achievement, yet still fewer women than men tend to choose jobs in engineering and sciences. In spite of comparable achievement levels in mathematics and science among boys and girls, recent studies on gender differences in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics careers show that women lag men in choosing careers in those areas. The Department of Commerce's Women in STEM report revealed that women represent a mere 24% of the STEM workforce. Yet, women who do not work in a STEM occupation earn 33% more than women working in a non-STEM workforce. The gender gap concerns many experts who fear that the United States may be losing its competitive edge over the rest of the world in science and engineering field because countries like China and India have so many more people in science and engineering fields. The United States needs women to enter STEM fields so the United States can expand its pipeline for math and science talent. For this reason, Race to the Top legislation mandates that states encourage not only STEM initiatives but also specifically STEM initiatives targeting school-age girls. One example of these efforts is a new partnership between NASA and Girl Scouts of America to develop opportunities for girls to engage in NASA STEM activities. Multiple explanations for this gender gap in STEM fields exist. Some say that girls aren't exposed to career opportunities in STEM fields, where in the middle, girls are exposed to career opportunities in STEM fields while in middle and senior high school, whereas others say that women look for careers where they can combine work and family, that STEM fields seem less compatible with this goal. And still another explanation is that girls may be choosing health-related and environmental-related fields because they see them as being more compassionate professions. In all probability, each of these explanations is valid, and for some portion of the female and in all probability, each of these explanations is valid for some portion of the female population. Some observers, while acknowledging this historic education discrimination and bias against girls, believe that schools are now failing boys more than girls. One clinical psychologist researcher at Harvard University argues that schools don't accommodate boys' learning styles and classroom needs. Boys perform best, he reports, when they have frequent recess breaks and are able to roam around the classroom. Boys are also more likely to enjoy argument and lively classroom debate, which is often discouraged. Research also cites the fact that the large gaps between the education levels of men and women that were evident in the early 70s have essentially disappeared for the younger generation. High school females, on average, outperform males in reading and writing, take more credits in academic subjects, take more advanced placement courses in English, biology, and foreign languages, are more likely to be inducted into National Honor Society, and are more likely to attend college after high school, and are likely to graduate with post-secondary degree. Furthermore, 2/3 of all students receiving special education services are boys. Boys are much more likely to drop out of school than girls. If schools were really so biased against females, they argue, why are women doing so well academically? What can you do to make sure you are being fair to both male and female students in your classroom to ensure sex equitable learning environments in classrooms? Teachers should consider the following steps. Have high expectations for all students. Examine instruction material to be certain the sexual stereotyping or bias does not occur. If it does, try to find alternative materials. Examine and address, if needed, the frequency in which the students are called on and the kind of responses they provide the students to ensure that gender biases are not occurring. This can be done by audiotaping teacher-student interactions and listening to unintended patterns of interaction. Look at who uses or is encouraged to use computer technology in the classroom. Often boys tend to monopolize computers and other technology. Eliminate the assignment of sex stereotype tasks. Organize classes so that students don't segregate themselves by sex. Model sex equitable behavior. Choose your words carefully and correct students' speech or actions when it borders on discrimination or bias. Pair learning with movement to increase brain activity and offset boredom. Some school districts are attempting to address gender differences by offering single-gender schools or classrooms. Advocates of this approach argue that by separating the sexes, more attention can be given to particular needs of boys and girls. Opponents argue that discrimination might still occur and suggest that keeping boys and girls together means they will learn to work with one another. At this point, insufficient research has been carried out to support either claim, but anecdotal reports claim success for some single-sex classrooms. People kept coming up to me and making fun of me. They would call me horrible names, and I would cry all the time. Letters were put in my locker saying things about AIDS and how my parents should have had me and how I should just die. Kids would threaten me after school and follow me home yelling things at me. No one should have to go through what I went through in school. This statement is by a lesbian student. This statement by a lesbian student reflects what many lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender students experience in school. According to a 2011 survey of 8,584 middle and high school students, the majority of LGBT students experience a hostile school climate. The survey defined a hostile school environment as one in which students hear biased remarks at school and feel unsafe at school because of their sexual orientation. 1/3 of LGBT students skipped at least one day of school in the previous month because of safety concerns. LGBT students have lower academic achievement and poor psychological well-being. You are likely to have LGBT students in your classroom, especially if you teach at middle or high school level, and you are apt to encounter LGBT parents of students at any level. You will also likely teach with LGBT colleagues who may also experience similar hostile school environments. Considerable evidence indicates that school is often a hostile environment for young LGBT students. Teenagers tend to ridicule differences in general and differences in sexual orientation in particular. LGBT students have often experienced taunting and harassment and even violence because of sexual orientation. Teachers and administrators who condone such name-calling as a dyke or faggot while prohibiting profanity or racial slurs are also promoters of hostility towards homosexual youth. In fact, LGBT students have won lawsuits against school officials who fail to maintain a school-safe environment and to discipline students who regularly tormented them. The hostility that LGBT youth encounter in school is mirrored in the larger society, which bombards them with messages that they are outcasts. This hostility leaves many of them isolated, frightened, and uncertain about their own worth. As a result, gay students are a high-risk population. Many run away from home, are thrown out by parents, abuse drugs and alcohol, suffer from depression, or attempt suicide. The National Education Association, the American Federation of Teachers, and other leading education associations have all passed resolutions calling on their members and school districts to acknowledge the special needs of LGBT students, provide supportive services such as counseling and support groups, and implement anti-harassment measures. 15 states in the District of Columbia prohibit anti-gay harassment or discrimination in schools over and above the protection afforded by the U.S. Constitution in Title 4. That's 9. I don't know, I can't read Roman numerals, apparently. And the U.S. Department of Education has issued guidelines spelling out that gay or lesbian students are covered by federal prohibitions against sexual harassment. Many schools have taken initiatives to create safe and inclusive school climate for all students, including LGBT students. Although all students stand the chance of becoming the victim of a bully, LGBT students are much more often the targets of bullying. Educating school staff and faculty also improves the environment for LGBT students. Often teachers are unsure how to discuss issues of bullying or gender roles with students. LGBT students report that they feel more accepted at school when they work with supportive teachers. Nevertheless, the issue of sexual orientation remains extremely controversial, and actions urged by gay and lesbian organizations are certain to provoke opposition by some community members who believe such a step would signal that schools are condoning homosexual behavior. Some people believe that while touting tolerance, LGBT organizations are actually seeking to promote homosexuality among students at a developmental period in their lives when the sexual identity of many is not fully developed. It will be important for you to be mindful of the community you teach within as you consider the steps you will take to ensure supportive learning and environments for your students. All students, regardless of their sexual orientation, have the right to a safe and supportive learning environment. As educators, we also have the responsibility to promote and protect the emotional well-being of our students. There are many things that schools and educators can do to make school safer for all students, as well as those who are gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender. Establish classroom guidelines about name-calling, challenge homophobic remarks everywhere and all the time, respect different points of view, make no assumption about students' families or their sexual orientation. Do not use the words gay, lesbian, bisexual. Use inclusive language such as partner, spouse, instead of husband or wife. Be role models for how students should be treated with respect and dignity. So far in this chapter, we have presented a great deal of information about the diversity of the children you will be teaching. Ultimately, how these children are educated will come down to you in your daily interactions with them in your classroom. How will you deal with diversity? Consider what we know about the typical teacher today. Women and whites predominate in the teacher force. 76% of all public school teachers are women, and 83% of those teaching in public schools are white. Despite efforts to increase the number of minority teachers, this gap between teachers and students is likely to persist for some time. Profiles of pre-service and beginning teachers show similar gender, racial, and ethnic patterns. Most of these teachers come from relatively stable family backgrounds. The majority of teachers and future teachers in our classrooms then come from very different backgrounds than many of the students they teach. As we mentioned in Chapter 2, what is school and what is it for? The more alike students and teachers are in social and cultural characteristics, the more they share tact expectations about behavior and academic performance. As gaps in those social and cultural characteristics widen, teachers need to rely on solid pedagogical training to overcome these differences. Too often, white educators have been reluctant to recognize their own backgrounds and the culture of the school have an effect on learning. As an incoming teacher, you will need to know about the commonalities and differences among students, and you will need to learn specific methods and techniques for addressing the plurality of culture and learning styles you will encounter. The school programs described in this chapter have been designed to address student diversity and create a more equal educational opportunity for children in our school systems. An inherent danger in these approaches to addressing diversity, however, is the tendency to label children and form stereotypical images of who they are. Student performance in school is affected by many factors, including social and cultural trends. The educational grouping we have been discussing are an administrative convenience, not all naturally occurring segmentation of children. Within each of these groups, each child will vary along a number of dimensions and have very different learning profile of strengths and weaknesses. Rather than thinking of minority students as having a culture that is valid, a bit different from theirs, teachers sometimes think of these students as deficient. We encourage you as a teacher to remember that we are talking about differences in students, not necessarily deficits. Teachers are challenged to recognize the diversity of cultures represented by their students and to address these cultures in their teaching. Given this profile of the cultural discrepancy between students and teachers, the complex of diversity today, studied by how can prospective teachers best prepare? Here are some steps to take now. Seek out experiences to broaden your understanding of societal and cultural commonalities and differences. Spend time in communities whose residents differ from you in terms of ethnicity, culture, or language. Volunteer in schools that differ from those you attended. Once you have your own classroom, what can you do to address diversity there? Here are some guidelines. Learn and appreciate the values and backgrounds of your students. Teach your students' strengths rather than making them feel incapable or deficit. Provide a variety of educational experiences and find ways for all students to achieve recognition from you and their peers for being good at something. Coordinate expertise and support with your students' parents, caregivers, or other professional staff at school so that students can get a consistent message. Without lowering standards, recognize that school traditions emphasize on middle-class values such as individual learning and competition. Make class with the values represented by the students' cultures. Teachers can provide opportunities for students to learn ways to succeed in today's dominant culture, but they must also respect the system value in students' home lives and help them in positive ways to bridge the gap between two worlds.